Hayden Girl had always believed she was one of the good ones, until the night she found herself standing over her neighbor's unconscious body, a bloody wrench trembling in her manicured hands, wondering how 17 years of perfect suburban life had led to this moment. The fluorescent lights of her garage buzzed overhead like angry wasps as reality crashed down around her. This wasn't supposed to happen to people like her. She volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends, brought casseroles to grieving families, and had never even gotten a speeding ticket. Yet here she was, staring at Marcus Williams sprawled across her concrete floor, blood pooling beneath his graying temples. Her mind raced backward through the events that had brought her here. It started 3 months ago when Marcus moved into the house next door with his loud music, aggressive dog, and complete disregard for neighborhood peace. Hayden had tried talking to him politely, then firmly, then desperately. She'd called the police 17 times about noise complaints, property damage, and threatening behavior. Each time, they'd given Marcus a warning that he'd ignore within hours. The breaking point came when she discovered her beloved garden destroyed. 20 years of careful cultivation reduced to trampled earth and broken stems. Her prize-winning roses, the ones that reminded her of her late mother, were scattered like corpses across her lawn. Marcus had done it deliberately, she knew, leaving his muddy boot prints like signatures across her devastation. That evening, Hayden had marched over to confront him one final time. The conversation started civil enough, but Marcus's sneering dismissal of her concerns triggered something primal inside her chest. When he laughed at her tears and called her pathetic old lady, the careful walls she'd built around her rage finally crumbled. Now, standing in the aftermath, Hayden felt a terrifying calm settling over her thoughts. The panic she expected never came. Instead, she found herself analyzing the situation with clinical detachment. Marcus was breathing but unconscious. There was no one around to witness what had happened. Her hands had stopped shaking. She dragged his body into her garage with surprising efficiency, her mind already calculating next steps. The rational part of her screamed that she should call an ambulance, confess everything, and accept the consequences. But a newer, colder voice whispered different suggestions. Marcus had made her life hell for months. He'd destroyed something irreplaceable. Maybe he deserved what had happened. Hayden caught her reflection in the garage window and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, her floral blouse stained with dirt and something darker. But it was her eyes that shocked her most. They held a hardness she'd never seen before, a calculating coldness that belonged to someone else entirely. She thought about her late husband David, how he'd always praised her gentle nature, her inability to hurt even the spiders she'd carefully relocate outside instead of killing. What would he think of her now? The question hurt, but not as much as she expected it to. Marcus stirred slightly, mumbling something incoherent. Hayden watched him with detached curiosity, noting how vulnerable he looked unconscious. This man who had terrorized her for months was just flesh and bone after all. The realization felt powerful in a way that frightened her. She could still call 911, claim it was self-defense or an accident. Her pristine reputation would work in her favor. But as she watched Marcus's chest rise and fall, another possibility crystallized in her mind. He'd threatened her multiple times, often when no one else was around. Who would really miss someone like him? The thought should have horrified her. Instead, it felt like a logical conclusion to an equation she'd been solving for months. Every sleepless night caused by his music, every destroyed plant in her garden, every moment of fear and helplessness he'd inflicted on her had been building toward this moment. Hayden realized she was still holding the wrench. Its weight felt natural in her hand now, like it belonged there. She thought about her quiet, orderly life and how Marcus had shattered that peace without consequence. The police wouldn't help. The law wouldn't protect her. But maybe she could protect herself. The garage fell silent except for the buzzing lights and Marcus's labored breathing. Hayden stared down at him, and for the first time in months, she felt completely in control. The good neighbor, the gentle soul, the woman who cried over dead birds, that person felt like a stranger now. Someone weak and naive who had allowed herself to be victimized. This new version of herself was different, stronger, more decisive. And as she raised the wrench again, Hayden Girl discovered something terrifying about human nature. Sometimes the only thing separating good people from evil ones is the right amount of pressure applied in exactly the right place. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder, casting harsh shadows across the garage floor where everything was about to change forever. The shower water ran pink as Hayden scrubbed Marcus's blood from beneath her fingernails. She'd been standing under the scalding spray for 20 minutes, watching the evidence of her actions spiral down the drain, yet feeling strangely disconnected from what she'd done. The woman who had bludgeoned her neighbor felt like someone else entirely. Someone whose memories she'd inherited, but whose actions she couldn't quite claim as her own. Marcus wasn't dead. That realization had both relieved and frustrated her in ways she didn't want to examine too closely. After the third blow, she'd stopped herself, horrified by the person she was becoming. She'd bandaged his head wound with supplies from her first aid kit. The same gentle hands that had once comforted injured animals now tending to someone she'd nearly killed. When he'd regained consciousness an hour later, Marcus had been different. Gone was the sneering aggression, replaced by genuine fear. He'd stammered apologies while Hayden helped him to his feet, her demeanor so calm and controlled that it seemed to unnerve him more than the attack itself. She'd suggested he might want to be more considerate going forward, her voice carrying an undertone that made him nod frantically. The neighborhood had been blissfully quiet for 2 weeks since that night. Marcus kept his music low, controlled his dog, and avoided eye contact whenever their paths crossed. Hayden should have felt guilty about what she'd done, should have been haunted by nightmares and consumed with remorse. Instead, she felt a satisfaction so profound it scared her. Her coworkers at the insurance office noticed the change immediately. Hayden had always been the quiet one, the pushover who took on extra work without complaint and never spoke up in meetings. But something had shifted. When Jim Henderson tried to dump his quarterly reports on her desk with his usual patronizing smile, Hayden looked him straight in the eye and said no. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Jim's face went through several expressions before settling on bewildered confusion. Hayden had never refused him anything in 8 years of working together. She watched him struggle with this new dynamic, saw the exact moment he realized that something fundamental had changed about the woman he'd been taking advantage of. That evening, Hayden stood in her kitchen preparing dinner with mechanical precision. The routine felt hollow now, like she was playing a role in someone else's life. She caught herself staring at the knife in her hand longer than necessary, testing its weight, imagining how easily it could slide between ribs. The thought should have appalled her. Instead, it felt like academic curiosity. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Jenny. "Haven't heard from you in weeks. Everything okay?" Hayden typed back a reassuring response about being busy at work, but the lie felt natural now. Jenny wouldn't understand the person she was becoming. Nobody would. The doorbell interrupted her thoughts. Through the peephole, she saw Detective Ray Morrison, a man she'd known from community meetings about neighborhood safety. Her heart should have hammered with panic, but instead, she felt only calculating awareness. She opened the door, wearing her most concerned expression. "Evening, Hayden. Sorry to bother you, but we've had some reports about noise disturbances in the area. Thought I'd check with residents to see if anyone's noticed anything unusual." His tone was routine, fishing for information without real suspicion. Hayden invited him in, offering coffee with the same warmth she'd always shown authority figures. They sat in her pristine living room while she expressed concern about poor Marcus, mentioning how he'd seemed different lately, quieter and more withdrawn. She painted herself as a worried neighbor, someone who might bring him a casserole to check on his well-being. Detective Morrison bought every word. Why wouldn't he? Hayden Girl had been a model citizen for 43 years. Her house was immaculate, her reputation spotless, her demeanor exactly what people expected from a grieving widow who channeled her energy into community service. The idea that she could be capable of violence was so far outside his mental framework that it never occurred to him to look closer. After he left, Hayden sat in the gathering darkness of her living room, processing what had just happened. She'd lied to a police officer's face without a tremor of nervousness. She'd manipulated him expertly, using his assumptions about her character to deflect suspicion. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like discovering a hidden talent. She thought about the self-defense classes she'd attended after David's death, how the instructor had emphasized the importance of controlled aggression. "Nice women get hurt," he'd said. "You have to be willing to hurt others first." At the time, the concept had seemed foreign to her nature. Now it felt like prophecy. Hayden walked upstairs to her bedroom, past the family photos that lined the hallway. Her smiling face gazed back from a dozen frames, captured at charity events and neighborhood gatherings, surrounded by people who trusted her completely. She paused at her wedding photo, studying David's proud expression as he looked at his bride. He'd fallen in love with her kindness, her inability to hold grudges, her instinct to nurture rather than harm. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone harder and infinitely more dangerous. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Looking back, Hayden could trace the fault lines that had been building for years. Every time she'd swallowed her anger to keep peace. Every instance of being taken advantage of because she was too polite to fight back. Every moment she'd prioritized others' comfort over her own dignity. Marcus had simply been the catalyst that cracked her open, revealing what had been growing underneath all along. The capacity for violence wasn't foreign to her nature. It had been there the entire time, carefully contained behind layers of social conditioning and moral constraints. Now those barriers had crumbled, and Hayden found herself curious about what other capabilities she might discover. She stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the dark neighborhood where people slept peacefully, trusting in the illusion of safety and the myth that monsters looked like monsters. They had no idea that evil could wear cardigans and bake excellent chocolate chip cookies. They couldn't imagine that the woman who organized their block parties might be planning their destruction. Hayden smiled at her reflection in the dark glass, and the stranger smiling back looked absolutely delighted with the possibilities ahead. 3 months had passed since Hayden's awakening, and the woman who emerged from that garage bore little resemblance to the person who'd entered it. She discovered that violence, like any skill, improved with practice and careful study. What started as an impulsive act of rage had evolved into something far more sophisticated and infinitely more dangerous. Her second victim had been Jessica Reeves, the PTA president who'd been embezzling funds from the elementary school's art program. Hayden had stumbled upon the evidence while volunteering for the spring fundraiser, finding discrepancies that revealed years of systematic theft. Instead of reporting Jessica to the authorities, Hayden had invited her for coffee to discuss the matter privately. The conversation had taken place in Hayden's kitchen, surrounded by cheerful yellow walls and the lingering scent of fresh-baked muffins. Jessica had tried to brazen it out at first, then begged when she realized denial was futile. Hayden had listened with the patience of a therapist, nodding sympathetically as Jessica explained her husband's gambling debts and their mounting medical bills. But Hayden's compassion had died in that garage 3 months ago. While Jessica wept and pleaded, Hayden calmly explained how the embezzlement would stop immediately, how Jessica would quietly resign from all school positions, and how a substantial anonymous donation would appear in the art program's account within the week. The alternative, Hayden had explained in the same tone she might use to discuss the weather, would be far less pleasant for everyone involved. Jessica had agreed immediately, her face pale with the recognition of something predatory behind Hayden's gentle smile. The donation had appeared as promised, and Jessica had moved her family to another state within the month. The official story was a job opportunity for her husband, but Hayden knew better. Jessica had recognized a kindred darkness and fled before it could consume her entirely. The experience had taught Hayden valuable lessons about power and perception. Physical violence was crude and risky. True control came from understanding people's weaknesses and exploiting them with surgical precision. Everyone had pressure points, secrets they'd do anything to protect, fears that could be leveraged with the right approach. Her third target had been Dr. Phillips, her family physician who'd been overprescribing opioids to vulnerable patients for years. Hayden had discovered his scheme while researching her neighbor Mrs. Chun's sudden decline and mysterious new medication regimen. The elderly woman had deteriorated rapidly, becoming addicted to painkillers she didn't actually need. Hayden's approach with Dr. Phillips had been elegantly simple. She'd scheduled a routine appointment and, during the examination, casually mentioned her new hobby of medical research and her fascinating discoveries about prescription patterns in their zip code. She'd watched his face change as understanding dawned, seen the moment he realized his career and freedom hung in the balance. The doctor's practice had cleaned up overnight. Mrs. Chen's medication was adjusted, and several other patients mysteriously found their prescriptions modified. Dr. Phillips had even started a community awareness program about opioid addiction, positioning himself as a reformed advocate for patient safety. Hayden attended his first presentation, sitting in the front row with an encouraging smile that made him stumble over his words. Each success had fed something hungry inside her, a growing appetite for control that no amount of satisfaction could fully appease. Hayden found herself studying people differently now, cataloging their weaknesses like a predator assessing prey. The mailman who drank too much, the school principal having an affair, the city councilman taking bribes. Everyone had secrets, and Hayden was becoming an expert at uncovering them. Her transformation hadn't gone entirely unnoticed. Her sister Jenny had commented during their monthly phone calls that Hayden seemed different, more confident, but somehow distant. Her book club friends mentioned that she'd become more assertive in their discussions, less willing to defer to others' opinions. Even the barista at her favorite coffee shop had remarked that she seemed more intense lately. But these observations remained surface level because people saw what they expected to see. Hayden Girl was still the helpful neighbor who brought soup to sick friends and organized community cleanups. She still smiled warmly and spoke softly and dressed in the same conservative clothes she'd always favored. The predator lived beneath the surface, invisible to those who'd known her before. The beauty of her position was its invisibility. Society had trained people to expect evil to announce itself, to wear leather jackets and scowl menacingly. They couldn't conceive that true malevolence might volunteer at charity events and remember everyone's birthday. Hayden had become a wolf in the most perfect sheep's clothing imaginable. Her latest project required more patience than the others. Thomas Warren, the corrupt building inspector who'd been taking bribes to overlook safety violations, would need careful handling. His corruption had resulted in a playground collapse that injured 3 children the previous spring. The incident had been covered up, blamed on weather damage, but Hayden had done her research. She'd been cultivating Thomas for weeks now, volunteering for the city's construction oversight committee and positioning herself as an eager citizen activist. He saw her as harmless, another do-gooder who could be managed with bureaucratic double talk. He had no idea that Hayden had already gathered enough evidence to destroy his career and send him to prison for decades. But prison seemed too easy for someone whose greed had hurt children. Hayden had been developing more creative solutions lately, punishments that matched the crimes more precisely. Thomas would face consequences, but they would be delivered with the same careful planning that had made her previous interventions so successful. As she prepared for bed that night, Hayden reflected on how much her life had improved since embracing her true nature. She slept better now, untroubled by the anxiety that had plagued her for years. People respected her in ways they never had before. Even her reflection looked different, sharper, and more defined. The woman in the mirror was someone who took action instead of suffering in silence. Someone who protected the innocent by eliminating threats. Someone who understood that the world was divided into predators and prey and had finally chosen her side. Hayden turned off the lights and smiled into the darkness, already planning tomorrow's moves in her expanding game of human chess. 6 months after that first night in the garage, Hayden Girl had become something she'd never imagined possible. A serial killer who'd never technically killed anyone. Her body count remained at 0, but her victim list had grown to include a dozen community members whose lives SHED systematically dismantled with surgical precision. The latest addition was Principal Martinez, whose embezzlement of special education funds had been exposed through an anonymous tip that led to his arrest and the recovery of stolen money. Before that, it was Judge Crawford, whose history of taking bribes for lenient sentences had been leaked to investigative journalists through carefully orchestrated evidence drops. Hayden had become a one-woman justice system operating from the shadows with terrifying efficiency. She sat in her pristine living room, reviewing newspaper clippings of her handiwork like a scrapbook of achievements. Each fallen target represented not just personal satisfaction, but proof of her evolution from victim to apex predator. The transformation had been so gradual that she could barely remember the woman who'd once cried over destroyed roses. Her methods had grown increasingly sophisticated. She'd learned to hack social media accounts, plant evidence in strategic locations, and manipulate public opinion through carefully crafted rumors. Technology had become her greatest weapon, allowing her to destroy lives from the comfort of her own home while maintaining perfect deniability. The phone rang, interrupting her reflection. Jenny's voice carried worry that had been building for months. "Hayden, I'm concerned about you. Mom's anniversary is next week, and you haven't mentioned it once. You've missed 3 family dinners, and when we do talk, you seem like a stranger." Hayden listened to her sister's concerns with growing irritation. Jenny represented everything weak about her former self: the need for approval, the desperate clinging to relationships that serve no practical purpose, the emotional vulnerability that made people easy targets. The old Hayden would have apologized profusely and promised to do better. This Hayden simply hung up. That evening brought an unexpected challenge. Detective Morrison returned to her door, but this time his demeanor was different. He declined her offer of coffee and remained standing in her foyer, his eyes scanning her home with professional assessment. "Funny thing happened today," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Got a call from Jessica Reeves in Colorado. She was pretty shaken up. Wanted to report some threats she'd received before leaving town. Mentioned your name specifically as someone who might have information about financial irregularities at the school." Hayden felt a familiar thrill at the direct confrontation. This was what she'd been unconsciously preparing for, the moment when her two worlds would collide. She maintained her expression of confused concern while her mind raced through possible responses. "Poor Jessica," she said softly, shaking her head. "I heard she was having some personal troubles before she moved. Financial stress can make people quite paranoid, don't you think?" Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly. "She also mentioned an interesting conversation you two had about art program funding. Said you seemed to know details about budget discrepancies that hadn't been made public yet." The detective was sharper than Hayden had given him credit for. She could see him connecting dots, drawing lines between her involvement in various community issues and the subsequent downfalls of corrupt officials. But suspicion wasn't evidence, and Hayden had been very careful about leaving traces. "I've always been detail-oriented," she replied, allowing a hint of pride to color her voice. "When you volunteer as much as I do, you notice when numbers don't add up. I just try to look out for the children's interests." They stared at each other across her foyer, and Hayden realized Morrison was conducting an interview, not a casual check-in. He suspected her involvement, but couldn't prove anything. The knowledge felt like vindication of her careful planning and execution. After he left, Hayden found herself energized rather than worried. The game had evolved to a new level, and she welcomed the challenge. Let them investigate. Let them search for evidence of crimes that existed only in the ethical gray areas between justice and vigilantism. She'd been careful to ensure that every target's downfall could be attributed to their own actions and the natural consequences of exposure. But Morrison's visit had revealed something troubling. Her appetite for control was growing beyond her ability to satisfy it safely. Each successful intervention had required greater risks and more elaborate schemes. The rush of power was becoming addictive, and Hayden could feel herself planning increasingly dangerous scenarios. The thought excited rather than worried her. She'd spent 43 years being safe, being good, being everything society expected from women like her. That life had been a prison of expectations and limitations. This new existence, while dangerous, felt authentically hers for the first time. As she prepared for bed, Hayden reflected on the psychology of evil that had fascinated her since childhood. She'd always wondered how ordinary people could commit atrocities, how neighbors could turn against neighbors, how gentle souls could become monsters. Now she understood the truth that textbooks couldn't teach. Evil wasn't a transformation, it was a revelation. The capacity for darkness existed in everyone, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Her targets hadn't been random victims. They'd been predators themselves, people whose corruption had caused real harm to innocents. Hayden had simply become a more efficient predator, one who hunted other hunters. In nature's hierarchy, she'd found her rightful place at the top. The future stretched ahead like an unwritten book, filled with possibilities that both thrilled and terrified her. There were so many corrupt officials, so many bullies, so many people who needed to learn that actions had consequences. Hayden Girl had work to do, and she was just getting started. Tomorrow, she would begin researching her next target. Tonight, she would sleep peacefully, dreaming of justice delivered by her own steady hands. If you've made it this far, you understand that evil isn't born, it's awakened. Like and subscribe for more psychological thrillers that explore the darkness within ordinary people. Share this story with someone who thinks they truly know their neighbors. Comment below. What would it take to push you past your breaking point? Your engagement helps us create more content that dives deep into the human psyche. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest psychological explorations.